Well, good evening, everyone. Greg Vinyl here, coming to you from the northern coast of the state of New South Wales in Australia here, and beautiful day here today, midday, and well, blue skies and a little bit of wind. Beautiful outlook here, looking out over the sea, and looking forward to spending the next hour or so talking to you about painting some lures. So, guys, I can see in the room at the moment we've got a few of you here. How about if I get each of you to just put something in the chat box there, let me know that you're hearing me okay, because it's always difficult when I'm running webinars to know whether people are hearing me. I can't see your reactions, can't see your faces, of course. So just let me know that you're hearing what I'm saying. So what I'm going to do this evening, we're going to pick up a little bit from where we left off last week, because we got interrupted during the last webinar. So I believe that during the opaque and transparent painting video, we had a internet outage, and so I lost you, and by the time I got you back, everyone was gone. So what I'm going to do is just finish off last week's webinar first and then move on to this week. So guys, I still don't have, okay, we've got a couple of people in the chat room there. Thanks, guys, for chatting in. So nice to know that you're hearing me okay. So what I'll do is I'll just rerun the video. I'm not sure how much you saw last week of the video on opaque and transparent paints, but I'm going to run that one again for you and just cover that off. And then we've got another one on transparent and pearl paints. I'll run that straight afterwards. And then we'll have a few questions if there's anything to clarify on last week's, and then we'll fire up on this week's lessons. So just bear with me a moment, and I'll scroll that transparent and opaque paint video up for you. All right, so back with you live for just a moment. I'm going to roll the second of the videos that got cut off last week. So this is transparent and pearl paints. So I'll just roll this one and then we'll have a quick chat over last week's lessons and any questions you might have. So bear with me as I set the video going. Okay, so look, that was basically the two tutorial videos that I was going to show you last week before we got cut off. So hopefully you can slot those back into where we dropped out last week, and that sort of completes that lesson, I guess. Now, Tyler, it sounds like you're still having a few issues with your airbrush there, mate. I think we're going to need to perhaps have a one-on-one chat. So as I've said in the chat box there, let's perhaps hook up on Skype, or I can do a hangout similar to what you're on now, to talk to you about that. You definitely should be able to use a Neo down to below 10 psi without any problems. Okay, so it may be, you haven't told me what paints you're using and what reducers you're using, but it may be the paints or reducers of the problem. The other thing that comes to mind is if you don't have a moisture trap on your compressor or on the airbrush, that can cause the same problem as well. You can get moisture coming through, water coming through the airline and diluting the paint in the airbrush, and it can cause a few problems as well. But definitely it sounds like there's something strange going on, because I use the Neo regularly down at around 8 to 9 psi. That's kind of the bottom of the range for that airbrush. The HPC Plus I can get into 5 PSI with no problems, but the Neo needs just a little bit more pressure. So let's have a one-on-one private hookup for that and get that sorted out for you, because you need to be able to get that fixed up before you can go on and paint detail stuff. All right, so any questions on what we've covered so far today? Because what we're going to do now is move on to kind of more of the techniques type stuff. So we've been through the equipment in a little bit of detail. Now I'd like to talk about some of the basic techniques we're going to use, and then over the next few weeks we're going to start painting some different patterns using the techniques and equipment that we've discussed. Okay, so there's no other questions come through from you guys. So if you're happy to continue on, I'll move on to this week's presentation, which let me just scroll through. We've already covered all this stuff. So this week what we're going to be talking about is preparing wood and plastic lures for painting. We're also going to cover sealer and base coat painting. Some quick tips on painting scales, which is obviously a fairly common process for lure makers. We'll look at painting spots, speckles and mottling. There are various techniques I use for that. And of course, gills, fins and craws and any of that detail type stuff where you want, sort of a little bit more lifelike appearance in your lures, I guess. So we'll start by preparing lures. So I'm going to start with plastic lures and resprays, because I know a lot of guys do like to buy plastic blanks and paint them, and others like to take old lures that they want to give a new lease of life and paint those up. So first step in preparing those is to give them a good clean with warm soapy water. Just a dishwashing detergent or some other mild detergent like that is fine. And all you need to do there is remove any slime, dirt, grease, scales, blood, that sort of stuff, whatever residues are there from fishing experiences. You need to wash those off before you start. Then what I'd normally suggest is that you go to work with a Britex pad or a piece of fine steel wool or a piece of wet and dry sandpaper, something like that, and take the gloss off the lure. Now the idea there is to finish up with a completely matte lure, so there's no gloss, no shine, and that allows the paint to adhere much more strongly. Next, I suggest that you give it a wipe with isopropyl alcohol. Now, you can use denatured alcohol here, that's not a problem. And the purpose of this is to remove any silicone or anything waxy or greasy that might cause the paint to not stick properly. And once you've done that, you're ready to go to work with your airbrush sealer. So you can start to dust on a couple of light coats of airbrush sealer and then move on to your base colors. So that's it for plastic lures and resprays, really pretty straightforward. For wooden lures, it's pretty much the same. There's just a couple of extra steps in the process before you get to that point. So what I like to do with my wooden lures is sand them smooth. I go down to about 400 grit usually, sometimes more, sometimes less, but 400 grit generally speaking. Then I warm the lures up to around about 125F. I do this in the just in the kitchen oven. Now, if you go much higher than that, if you get up to around the 150 sort of a mark and you're using an epoxy adhesive, you'll find that that starts to soften. It will harden again once it cools down, but it's better to not exceed that, and you don't need to anyway. But if you warm up to about 125 degrees Fahrenheit, and what that does is it just opens up all the pores in the wood, right? So the next step we're going to do is to apply an epoxy to the lure, and if the pores are nice and widely opened, then that epoxy can soak much deeper into the wood, which has a much greater effect on the hardness and the waterproofness and all that kind of stuff. So the epoxy that I use is Envirotex Light, aka Etex in lure making circles. And what I do is I thin it down around about 2 parts Envirotex Light to 1 part denatured alcohol. And then I brush that on and that soaks right in deep into the wood. Now, while that's soaking in, I then give the lure another coat. This is an optional step, you don't have to do this, but I often give the lure another coat of Envirotex, and the second coat I have loaded up with some stuff called titanium dioxide. Now, you'll find this on eBay. It's used in cake decorating and cosmetics and all kinds of stuff. It's also the pigment that's used to create really bright sharp white paints. Okay, so if you mix a little bit of titanium dioxide into your Envirotex when you're sealing the lure, what it'll do is give you this nice crisp white surface to paint over that doesn't require as much paint to cover up any of the grain or knots or anything that you're trying to cover over with your airbrush paints later on. Once the resin's cured, and I usually give it a few days to really set hard, because if you thin the Envirotex down with denatured alcohol, you'll find it stays a bit rubbery for a little while. It takes a while for it to set completely. So I normally try and give it at least 3 or 4 days, but as a minimum 24 hours before you wet sand with 400 grit. And again, the purpose here is just to level everything, smooth everything, and take the gloss off the lure so that the paint can stick to it. So what I'm going to do now is just run you through, I've got a video tutorial for the sealing process. So let's put that up, and I'll go through that step by step, and you can see it all being done. And then we can come back and discuss any questions you might have on that. Okay, so look, that's the process that I use for hardening wood and sealing it and waterproofing it usually. The advantage of treating it with something like Etex is that once that resin has soaked right into the wood, even if the paint gets chipped or the clear coat gets cracked or a tooth punctures it, the wood itself has become impregnated with the resin, so it's quite waterproof. It means your lures don't tend to get waterlogged, and your paints or your paint jobs tend to last a lot longer. Now, sometimes if I'm doing lures out of balsa or something like that, I'll simply use something like a Minwax wood hardener, and that'll do just as good a job. The reason I like the Envirotex is that quite often I'm working with cedar and some of those timbers that might have a little bit of tannin in them, and the Envirotex also locks in the tannin and gives me a much smoother surface to work off. But if you want a quicker way, then there's nothing wrong with the old Minwax wood hardener. So what I'd like to do now is talk briefly about painting the sealer and base coats. Okay, so this is getting started with the airbrush really, and just let me switch over to the correct presentation here. So if you have the luxury of more than one airbrush, like I do, then what I'd normally go for is a larger nozzle airbrush that operates at higher air pressure. Okay, for coating your sealer coats and your base colors. And the reason I like that is that you want to be able to put these coats on pretty quickly. You want good coverage, right? So you're not too worried about getting detail in your paint at this stage. You just want to get these colors down so that you can get onto the next stage of painting the detail. So a 0.5mm nozzle allows a lot more paint to go through, but it does require a little bit higher air pressure to do that, which is not a problem if you're not using stencils. The other thing with my sealer and base colors is that I often don't dilute them as much as I do when I'm painting detail. Now, when you're using a larger nozzle airbrush and higher air pressure, you still get good atomization, even if the paint is a little bit thicker. Now, I still don't ever run it undiluted, but I might go down to 7:1 or 7:2 paint ratio instead of the usual 6:4. Okay. And the reason for that, once again, is you get better coverage. So more paint transferred with each pass of the airbrush. Now, for some reason, I don't know why, it doesn't seem to matter what brand of paints I use in airbrush acrylics. It doesn't matter whether it's the sealer coat or the base colors. Doesn't matter whether it's a metallic paint or an opaque paint or whatever. For some reason, I find that if I put that first coat of paint on, even just slightly too heavily, it blows around over the surface of the lure and you finish up with this sort of blotchy mess. So what I would normally do is really mist on a very, very light first coat. And then I hit that with a hairdryer for about 10 seconds just to drive off any of the solvent. And then subsequent coats can go on a little bit more heavily, and you'll find that they don't blow around. Now, I don't know why that happens. It's just been my experience, so that's what I tend to do. Now, usually if I'm doing a dark color for a base color, then 2 or 3 coats is enough, and you'll find that the grain and anything that you want to cover over has been covered with 2 or 3 coats. If you're doing a yellow or a light green or a white or something like that, you might find that you need 5, maybe even 6 coats sometimes to cover up the grain underneath. Now, an important point here is with the sealer coats. So with the airbrush sealers, this is either Auto Air or Auto Born airbrush sealers. They don't have to get full coverage. And by that I mean, all you need to do is give the lure a coat of these things. And if you can still see the grain through, that doesn't really matter, because all the sealer is doing is giving you adhesion of the paint to the lure. Okay, and that's important whether you're doing a respray or whether you're doing a plastic blank or whether you're doing a wooden lure. That sealer coat will just give you adhesion to the lure, and then what you do after that is you go over it with an opaque color to obliterate the grain and give you the full, smooth, even coverage that you're after. All right, so let's move on to one of the more common lure painting processes, I guess, and that is painting scale. Now, there are various ways of doing it. You can buy mesh scale from various online sources. It's usually an aluminum mesh or a copper mesh that can be bent around your lures. I find that it tends to damage the base color too much, and I don't like the harder scale mesh. So I tend to just use soft mesh, and you'll find this stuff just about anywhere. So one of my favorites for doing really small stick baits at the moment is a piece of a mesh bag that came from the supermarket with garlic in it. Okay, so but onion bags, I've used water filter mesh. I've used all kinds of things. If you get stuck, go down to the haberdashery shop and walk in and go around some of the tulle fabrics and that sort of stuff, and you'll find that for about 50 cents a foot, you'll pick up a bunch of good scale mesh. Loofahs are also a good source of scale mesh. So just hunt around. You'll find that you'll start collecting the stuff wherever you go. It becomes quite annoying for family members that you're always scrounging up bits of fabric, bits of rubbish to put in your scaling collection. So whenever I'm scaling, I always work at low pressure, and by low pressure I mean never much more than about 10, maybe 12 psi, but usually it would be 10 psi or less, and with quite dilute paint. And by dilute paint, I mean, you know, I could even be going down to 1:1, 1 part paint, 1 part reducer. Now, Tyler, you're having a few issues with this, so we need to resolve that, because you will need to be able to do that to get really good scale pattern. Although I've seen some of your bluegills and the scale on those looks excellent, so it hasn't held you back, but I'm sure we can improve and make it a bit easier for you to achieve those results. With scale, as with most detail work, you're better off to paint lots of light coats and give the lure a good dry in between coats, okay? You'll find that you build the colour up more evenly, you're less likely to blow the paint underneath the scale mesh, it's less blotchy, and you've got better control over the colour build as well. So you'll finish up with a much crisper result if you do multiple light coats as opposed to 1 or 2 heavy ones. So I'm just going to play you a video. I apologise for the black screen there. Let me just go back. I'm just going to play you a video now of some scaling techniques, and then we'll come back and talk a bit more about some other effects. Okay, so we're going to use those techniques a little bit more next week, of course, when we start painting some fish patterns. So that should give us the opportunity to practice those and perfect them. But as I say, the main thing to remember there, really dilute paint, really puff it on light and dry between coats so that the scale doesn't get, the paint doesn't get blown underneath the scale mesh. So I'm just going to whiz through some techniques. I won't talk too much about these because there's a video tutorial to follow that will go into a bit more detail. But for painting freehand spots, so for example, if you're painting a herring or a shad or something like that, you want to put a spot on it, or a bluegill, you want to put an ear on it. What I would normally suggest is that, once again, you work at very low pressure with very dilute paint, and once again with a gravity feed airbrush. So remember, a gravity feed airbrush, because the paint's coming into the airstream via gravity, requires less air pressure to deliver the paint, gives you better atomization at those lower pressures, which gives you a lot more ability to paint detail. So once again, I'd be down in the 5 to 10 PSI range if I was freehand painting spots, maybe 12 PSI, wouldn't go much higher than that though. And that allows you to have the needle of the airbrush right up close to the lure. Now, I can't remember whether I mentioned last week, but usually when I'm painting detail stuff, what I'll do is I'll take the needle cap off the airbrush, okay, and that helps a lot to get a cleaner spray pattern. So you've got to be very careful not to damage the needle, but it does make it much easier to paint detail. Now, the process for painting spots is pretty simple. You start your airflow. This is with a dual action airbrush, of course. You start your airflow first, you point the airbrush at the lure, and then you just rock the needle back gently, and you do that 2 or 3 times to build the color up. You'll know if you put too much on, because you'll suddenly start to blow paint around. It'll be a messy spot. Okay, so once again, lots of light puffs. Now, if you point the airbrush at the lure and you've got the airflow flowing, and you puff a little bit of paint on, then you let the air flow for a bit longer, you'll find that that is enough to dry the paint. Okay, just give it a few seconds of air from the airbrush, will dry the paint, and then you can put on another puff and you can build the color up that way. The other kind of spotting we do is speckle or stipple, which is obviously much smaller dots. So you can hand paint these, of course, but what I like to do is use a technique called the Iwata spatter, right? And what that involves is taking off not just the needle cap, but also taking the nozzle cap off the airbrush. And when you do that, what happens is that it gives this spattery random sort of an effect. Now, to control that spattery random effect, what I'll do is adjust the air pressure, okay? And the higher the air pressure, the finer the speckle will be, and the more even it'll be. Lower air pressure, you tend to get larger spots, and they're a little bit more random. I'll show this in a video in just a moment. The other technique, if you don't have an Iwata airbrush, the other technique you can use with most dual action airbrushes, except for the trigger action ones, it's a bit of a problem for them, but it's called rock the needle. And what I do there is I point the airbrush down at the workbench, and I pull back on the needle without pressing down on it at all, okay? And I'll do that 2 or 3 times. Now, what that does is it loads up the needle with paint, right? And then I'll just tap on the needle, press it down once in a short blast, and that'll blow the paint off the needle, and you finish up with this spatter effect. And you become quite proficient at it after a while. You 2 or 3 pumps of the needle, 1 puff of air, 2 or 3 pumps of the needle, 1 puff of air, and you'll get this nice speckling effect. And the final way, of course, is to put down the airbrush, pick up a toothbrush or some other fine brush, dip it in the paint, run your thumb over it, and just flick the paint at the lure. And that'll give you a fairly random effect as well. So what I'll do now is just play a quick video on how to paint speckle and stipple, and then we'll go on to some other effects as well. Oh, sorry, hang on, let me just go through the presentation a bit further. Yeah, so I'll do the speckle and stipple, we'll come back to the gills, fins, and craw shells. Okay, so look, that's just the basics to get us started. We're going to use a lot of those techniques and some others that I didn't demonstrate as well over the next few weeks, particularly in the frog and craw section. There's a technique I use quite a bit that involves using a liquid frisket, which I think you'll enjoy as well. So what I'd like to do now is go on and have a look at gills, fins and craw shells. Now, if you've been to the free webinar, I think both of you guys have, then you've probably seen this video before, but I'm going to play it again anyway. Just so that it refreshes in your mind, and we can discuss it afterwards if you want. So for me, the first trick always to painting gills and shells and scales, fins, anything like that, any kind of detail work, is to use transparent paints. Okay, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that they allow you to work at lower air pressure. Another is that they allow you to build the color up much more gradually. So it's more forgiving. Right? If you make a mistake with a transparent paint, it usually takes a few coats before that mistake really becomes apparent. Whereas if you do it with an opaque paint, it can really ruin the finish straight away in one coat. Now, if you need to dilute the color down, this might be a tip for you, Tyler, to give a try. If you need to dilute the color down so that you can control how fast the color builds, but your paint is getting too thin, so if you're getting down below 1-to-1 sort of dilution ratios, then you might want to look at using a transparent base. Now, you'll get this from Auto Air, and basically what it is paint, acrylic paint, but without the pigment. So it's got the solvents, it's got the medium, it's got the binders, it's got the stuff to make the surfactants and the like to make the paint flow through the airbrush nicely. It just doesn't have any color, right? So when you add that to your paint, it doesn't actually thin the paint, it only thins the color, if that makes any sense to you. So for example, if you were to take a black paint, transparent black paint, and dilute it 50-50 with transparent base, you'd still need to reduce the base to get good reduce the paint to get good atomization. But what you'd find is it'd take twice as many coats to get the full coverage that you get with the transparent black paint without the transparent base. So that's just a trick to allow you to really build the colors up gently and work with reasonably thick paint, or slightly thicker paint, without overdoing the color. So for all my detail work, I use a small nozzle. Usually I use a 0.3. If you've got a 0.2, that's even better. And I work at around about 5 to 10 PSI. Now with the Neo, Tyler, it's normally around 8 to 10 PSI. It needs a little bit more air pressure than the HPC Plus. But with the HPC Plus, I can work quite happily at 5 PSI. So it just depends on your paint dilution, all that kind of stuff. Your airbrush has got to be absolutely squeaky clean, of course. But those are the settings that I would normally use for painting detail. Now, what we're going to do is spray the edge of the stencil, right? And one of the big mistakes I think that newbies to lure painting make is that they put the stencil down and they spray the lure. And the problem with that is you get a very thick, heavy, amateurish looking, clumsy looking result. Whereas if you spray the stencil, you can get a really delicate, subtle, more sophisticated look. Once again, I've given you a black screen. I apologize for that. So I'm going to roll the video that I showed you during the free webinar, which is the painting craw shells, so the 3D effects type painting, and then we'll go on. Oh, no, I apologize. I haven't actually got that video rolled up or set up to roll, so I'm going to have to skip it. But you will find that in the tutorial. Hopefully by now both of you guys have been onto the website, into the members area, and you've found all the tutorial videos, so you will be able to watch that video again if you want to. If you have any trouble finding it, flick me an email and I'll send you a link so you can watch the craw shell video once again. So what I do have, even though I don't have the video set up, is I do have the slide in here, so I can show you. I can demonstrate it on the slideshow. So this is a craw shell pattern that we paint. It's actually one of the patterns that you'll find in the members area. So there's full instructions on doing this one, telling you all the colors to use and techniques and stencils and all that sort of thing as well. And what you'll find I do is that I lay the stencil down over the top of the lure, and then I spray on the stencil. So if you imagine that this spot is, it represents the spray that's coming out of the airbrush. You notice that the dark center where the airbrush is centered on the stencil is not on the lure. Now, if I was to have that dark center running around the lure instead of the edge of the stencil, I'd finish up with a much thicker, darker effect, and it wouldn't give me the 3D result that I'm looking for. So if I just go back to the picture of that lure, you'll see that that front section of the craw shell there, notice how the shadow is wider there. It's crisp on one edge, clean, sharp edge on the left. On the right-hand side, it fades away. But if you look at the craw shell towards the tail, you'll notice that the shell is, or the shadow is narrower. Now, what I've done there is I've just, for the one at the front, I've lifted the airbrush away from the lure a little bit more, so the spray pattern's a bit bigger, and I've built that up over a few more coats. And by making that a bit wider, it gives the impression of greater depth. Whereas at the tail, where the shell is normally a little bit narrower, I don't want quite the same depth, so I've moved the airbrush in a little bit closer, and I've made the shell look as though it's a little less deep at that point. Okay, I'd like to just quickly cover eyes, and there are a couple of techniques. I do spray eyes from time to time, but there are a couple of techniques that I'm going to show you tonight that don't involve airbrushing. One is that I'll show you how I dab paint eyes. It's a really simple technique, of course, and you've probably done it 100 times already, but I'll give you my take on it. The other thing I'd like to show you is how to make your own 3D eyes. Okay, now this is really useful if you want your lures to be distinctive, you want something a bit different from what is available off the shelf, or if you need a different size or something like that. Pretty simple to do. Tyler, it's probably something that you could use if you wanted to make your lures stand out from competitors, because I know that you're looking at doing this commercially. So for example, at the moment I'm experimenting with using Holoscale, which is a holographic mirror reflective tape that I've developed for lure making. And I'm looking at using that for doing the eyes on some of my lures as a 3D eye. So lots of different things you can do there. But anyway, I'll run the videos for you, and you can see just how easy it is to do it for yourself. Okay, guys, so what I'd like to do now, just to finish off today's webinar, is have a bit of a chat about Envirotex Lite. Now, Tyler, this may or may not be of interest to you, but Jordan, probably it's going to be of interest to you, I suspect. So Envirotex Lite is the resin that I use, generally speaking, for clear coating my lures. There are some exceptions when I use other things, but at the moment, it's the one that I normally recommend. And I kind of have a love-hate relationship with Envirotex Lite. Okay, it's not the easiest stuff to use. It's quite laborious. There are lots of things that can go wrong. I really have a problem with it these days because I've been doing it for so long, but I do still find it tedious and laborious and wish that there was a faster way. At the end of the day, though, the result you get with Envirotex Lite is hard to beat. Okay, it gives you that really thick, clear, lustrous, wet look, and not only great looking, but also very durable finish as well. It does scuff like any clear coat, but it's better than most of them. So my tricks for apply Envirotex Lite, first thing is you really got to measure the stuff carefully, and you really got to mix it really carefully. Okay, so it's really important to get a one-to-one mix with Envirotex Lite. It's not like, for example, fiberglass resin, where if you add a little bit more of part B, it just means the stuff's going to dry faster. What happens with Envirotex Lite is the two parts react together in equal quantities, and they form a compound in equal quantities. It's not a catalyzed reaction, it's a polymeric action. So what that means is if you've got too much of part A or if you've got too much of part B, then what will happen is that excess will stay there in the resin permanently, and it means that the stuff stays a little bit sticky, and no matter what you do, you will not be able to clear it off. Okay, you can't wipe it clean, you can't sand it off. Putting another coat of Envirotex over the top doesn't work because it's sticking onto something that's not really not really adhered well itself. So it's a bit like building a house on sand, right? There's no foundation underneath, so the second coat's only going to fail. So really important to get an exact one-to-one mix. So as you saw earlier on, I use syringes to measure out my Envirotex so that I get exactly equal quantities. And when it comes to mixing the stuff, I mix it up in a shot glass, plastic disposable shot glass with a popsicle stick. And I normally say to people, mix it until you're absolutely sure that it's completely mixed, and then mix it for another 5 minutes. And then once you've done that, mix it for another 5 minutes, okay? Because really with this stuff, you've got quite a long pot life before it's no good to brush on. And so you may as well make sure that it's really well combined so you don't have any problems down the track. The next thing I suggest is you paint the stuff on thick. Now, I do know some people that airbrush Envirotex on. They thin it down and airbrush it on. It requires some pretty specialized equipment in terms of sophisticated extraction systems and face masks and all that kind of stuff. So I don't normally recommend it, but it can be sprayed on. But if you paint it on really thick, the good thing about it is that it self-levels, and the epoxy, because it generates some heat internally as it cures. If you paint it on a bit thicker, it generates a little bit more heat, and so it tends to cure a bit faster and a little bit harder. Okay. In order to be able to paint it on thick, though, you need to be able to keep the lure moving while it's drying. So you'll find in the ebook, you'll find some plans for building a rotating drying rack, and that's exactly the reason that I do that, is that I like my lures to be rotating for at least the first 4 to 5 hours, maybe a little bit more, while that resin's just starting to tack up and cure, and then after that, I can hang them somewhere warm and dry to finish curing, but I like them to be on that rotating wheel for at least 4 or 5 hours. Envirotex Lite, like any epoxy, is a bit like a dust magnet. So if there's a particle of dust anywhere to be found and you've got Envirotex on the lure, it's going to find its way onto the surface. Okay, so you really want a nice dust-free, warm environment. The other thing I've found with Envirotex is sometimes if the temperature's fluctuating while it's curing, you can get all kinds of weird effects. Sometimes you get this kind of like an orange skin dimpling effect all over the lure. And I used to take the time to sand that back and then recoat it. And then I found that just by applying another coat of Envirotex over the top 24 hours later, usually the stuff self-levels and you can't even see any sign of that dimpling. So just keep that in mind if you do have a problem with that. I use a minimum of 2 coats of Envirotex on all of my lures, unless I'm painting really small stick baits or tiny micro crankbaits. or suspending jerkbaits or something like that, in which case I tend to use a polyurethane, a moisture-cure urethane, because it goes on a bit thinner. But 2 coats minimum. If I'm doing big surface poppers for GTs, I'll put on 3 coats at least, usually 4 coats, okay? So giving that lure plenty of thick, lustrous, clear, hard protection, like a big armor coat around the lure. And as far as I can with Envirotex, I normally recommend disposable everything. So like I say, I use popsicle sticks, I use disposable shot glasses that cost about 3 cents each, and I use disposable brushes that I get off eBay. They're a lip gloss brush for a couple of cents each. It's just not worth the effort of trying to clean brushes with this stuff. They never really come clean, and it's a lot of work for not much reward. If you can buy the things for a few cents each, why wouldn't you? So guys, that brings tonight's presentation to an end, and I'm glad to say, as far as I can tell anyway, we haven't had an internet outage, and so you're still with me. So if you've got any questions, please fire them through. Questions about tonight, questions about last week, questions about what's coming up next week, or anything you might want to ask about lure painting, I'm all ears. So, okay, so can I provide more details on Glisten PC? Best way to apply it, how to seal compared with DevCon 2. I haven't used Glisten a lot, but when I have used it, I've dipped the lures. So it's a moisture cure urethane, but it's a 2-pack moisture cure urethane. And the advantage of that is that until you mix the 2 parts together, it's not so reactive with the moisture in the air, which means that it's got a longer shelf life, right? Once you mix the 2 parts together, then it's like any other moisture cure urethane. You've got to protect it from moisture in the atmosphere because it'll start to set in the can. So that means that you can buy a batch of Glisten PC and you can just mix up small amounts as you need them. Now, the best way I've found to apply it, like I say, I haven't done this a lot, but the best way I've found of applying Glisten PC is to get a long, tall tube and pour the activated moisture cure urethane into a long, tall tube, and then just dip the lures into it. Okay, dip them in, take them out, and I normally just hang them over a piece of blotting paper and let the excess run off until they're cured. And usually 2 coats is enough, sometimes 3. For some of the really small lures, I'll only do a single coat because I just don't want to weigh them down with a lot of clear coat. So I hope that answers the question on the Glisten. I wouldn't call myself an expert on it, but that's how I've used it in the past. Typical drying time between ETEX coats, it varies tremendously. I live in a part of Australia where the humidity and the temperature can get quite high. Now I don't know what the conversions are in Fahrenheit, but it's not unusual for me to be working at sort of round about the 95 to 105 degree Fahrenheit sort of temperature range. And in those conditions, the Envirotex cures pretty quickly, and you can probably put a second coat on within 12 to 15 hours. I actually like to put the second coat on before the first coat is really super hard, right? And the reason I like to do that is there's kind of still this little bit of chemical bonding going on. If you wait until the first coat's really hard and you put the second coat on, it's just like putting one coat on top of another. But if you wait for the first coat to go mostly hard, then put the second coat on, they actually chemically bond so that it becomes just like one solid coat, if you know what I mean. So normally I'd say sort of 12 to 14 hours. If you handle them very, very carefully, you can probably put on a second coat. Okay, but it really is a case of just suck it and see, because the humidity and the temperature make a really big difference to how fast the stuff dries. Okay, guys, any other questions? Happy to hang around for a bit longer if you've got questions. Otherwise, what I might do is just wrap it up and look forward to talking to you again next week when we'll start painting some fish patterns. Now, also want to check whether you guys have been able to access your members area. Have you been onto the website? It's crazylureart.com/login. So you would have created login details for that. You should now be able to access all the tutorials for lessons 1 and lessons 2 on that members area. So, and lesson 3 will become available to you around about this time next week. Okay, guys, it looks like there's no further questions. So what I'm going to do is turn off the microphone for a moment, and I'll just stay in the chat room for a couple of minutes just in case you think of anything else, or in case you get caught up in the delay. Okay, I'm having an issue with the system at my end. I can't see who's making the comments, but obviously one of you can log on okay, so that's great. But if you do have any trouble with that at any stage, just fire me an email. Okay, guys, so I'm going to turn off the mic. But like I say, I'll stick around for another few minutes in the chat room if you've got any questions. Otherwise, thanks for coming along tonight. I've enjoyed talking to you. And next week gets a little bit more exciting because we're actually going to start painting some fish patterns. And I always enjoy that part of the workshop. All right, guys, well, it's good night from me, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye for now. Okay, I've just seen the message come through just as I was turning off the mic. You haven't been on the website yet. Can I shoot an email with what day works to chat about painting issues? Okay, that's obviously coming from Tyler. I'm having an issue at my end seeing who's sending the messages, so apologise for that. No problems, Tyler. I'll shoot you an email and we'll hook up. Probably over the weekend is the best time for me to do that. We're travelling at the moment, but I'll be in internet range over the weekend. So that's probably the best time, and I'll organise that via email. Okay, guys. Well, on that note, I wish you a good evening and look forward to talking to you next week. If you've got any issues, of course, fire me an email. You can do that at any time. Otherwise, I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Bye for now.